Tu podcast w głowie się mieści. Okay, so it's podcast Wrap Your Head Around It. My today guest, he don't need any introduction, but I'll do. Stevenem C. He is a Nevada Foundation Professor of Psychology in the Behavior Analysis Program at the Uniwersytetu of Nevada. He is an author of, I don't know, is it actual? Probably not, as I know from your previous interviews, but it's 37 books. Probably maybe he's one of the newest books, learning process-based CBT. Maybe this is one of the newest books, yeah. And you are an author of nearly 670 scientific articles, and mostly your career is focused on the analysis of the nature of human language and cognition and the application of these things to understanding the elevation of human suffering. He is also a developer of relational frame theory. It's an account of human higher cognition and has guided its extension to ACT, like you also developed ACT and created to like a psychotherapy approach, an evidence-based form of psychotherapy that uses mindfulness, acceptance, and is values-based method. And it's also what is important, in my opinion, that this is trans-diagnostic approach, contextual. And also you have tremendous achievements in the world of science, but I also like your speeches. Yeah, at the one event, people were asking me in general about to say something about the psychotherapy, and I play your TED talk about psychological flexibility, and the people on this party, they start to be silent while they were watching this movie, and on the 1 second they start to make them a little bit silence, yeah, more, and they don't want to disturb you while you were on the TV, and after 1 minute they realized that you are on the TV and they wasn't taking any consciousness altering drugs. So for me, you are also a great speaker. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm glad you like the talks, because I enjoy doing them, and sometimes you can do that. You can be yourself in ways that you can't do in scientific articles.
Yeah, but as I know from your work that giving those talks, it wasn't for you easy always. Yeah, like you also felt some anxiety before talks. And like going to my first questions, what were the milestones that influenced you most as a scientist, therapist, and in general, the human being?
It's a big question, but I think in terms of what influenced me the most as a human being in the arc of my work, it was probably seeing suffering in my home. And I think a lot of psychologists are like that, is that either you know something about suffering from the inside out, you individually, or you've just seen it in your family and those that you love, perhaps even as children. That was certainly true in my case. But in terms of my professional development, I gravitated to psychology because I really cared about science and math on the one hand. On the other hand, I cared about art, literature, things of that kind. Um, Even edited the literary magazine in college for my university. And I thought, even as a high school student, that what is the one field that would let you have both those interests? And I said, well, psychology maybe, which turned out to be a pretty wise choice. I don't know where I came up with it, but I suppose it was because this is in the era where things like magazines in the US, like Psychology Today, were just sort of hitting, like the idea that you could actually look at psychology as a science and apply it to yourself as an individual was just forming in the culture.
Yeah,
so my early heroes were the humanists, Abraham Maslow, people like that. But I became frustrated with what they were doing scientifically, even though they were scientists, not that they weren't committed, but they really had a vision that things had to be different. And when I came across Walden 2, which was Skinner's utopian novel, which is not an answer. It's not here's how it'll be, but it was a vision. Here are the kind of questions we should ask. And as by then, kind of early hippie, very much interested in communes and how we should arrange life so that it supports people and so forth. That wave of really wanting to look at what supports prosperity in human living, coming out of an era, that is the sort of the man in the gray flannel suit, the very tight 50s, in post-war, you just got to work, and a house with a white picket fence and all of that. It was a transformational vision to believe that you could go from rats to Walden 2. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do that. But then I ran into the frustration of we're not rats. I mean, the things that rats and pigeons use to learn are part of our psychology, a very important part. And to this day, evidence-based therapy relies on these things, but it's not what you and I are doing right now.
Yeah, even if genetically we are familiar, but we are a lot of more complicated.
Well, and shockingly, if you look at the amount of genetic overlap between us and chimpanzees, you would almost think we should be able to crossbreed. I don't know if anybody's ever tried it. It's probably not safe, but it's pretty dark. It's 98% or something. It's a ridiculous proportion of the genome.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
We shouldn't be so high and mighty. The hominins were split off of, and yet you and I are doing something right now that is different than the bird outside the window.
Yeah,
and life will be different 10 years from now for us in a way that is fundamentally different than the bird outside the window. Life's not going to be that different for them, other than what we do in terms of climate change and other horrors. But so. Finding a way forward with relational frame theory, having the very good fortune to develop a panic disorder that took me all that down to the point that I literally wouldn't be able to be a academic. I couldn't even give a lecture to a class of 6 people without panic attacks.
Yeah.
And then seeing that some of the things that were in the hippy dippy days, that were in humanistic psychology, that were in human development and human potential and Esalen and all this kind of crazy stuff that was going on in the 60s and 70s, put me in a different direction. And we went, I do have to say, I'm kind of proud of this part, and I'll try to land the plane here in a second, but ACT is 40 years old, acceptance and commitment therapy, 40 years old as of this month. The first workshop was given in 1982 in North Carolina in October. And we really weren't visible to the field until 1999 when the first text came out. And because we were doing very few outcome studies, just a few, just enough. Did 3 in the early 80s. They all worked, put them in a file drawer. I didn't want to publish any of them, even though they all worked, because I thought the day would come when we had to have a model measures, even a philosophy of science well worked out, basic science worked out. Because if you're going to say something so crazy sounding as, there's something really inside our wisdom traditions and spiritual traditions and some of these deeper clinical traditions that the evidence-based therapists need to attend to. I mean, this is without any models. There wasn't a John Kabat-Zinn. There wasn't anything like that. So we went into the invisible world of working in the labs and sort of in the basement trying to work out stuff. And then finally, 20 years later, almost stepped forward with a text. And people then kind of being very upset sometimes with it. And you're trying to tear down the house. But now, 20 years later, seeing that ACT is part of evidence-based therapy by almost every credentialing body, the NICE guidelines in the UK or the Centers for Disease Control or the World Health Organization so that's been the journey. It's been an exciting journey of trying to create a psychology more worthy of the challenge of the human condition that begins in the challenge I saw in my home. Soon enough showed up as a challenge that was inside my own body. And here I am 40 years later.
Right. So it's a beautiful story, very touching also my heart. And also I have a question that is connected with it. During your path, did you have any doubts, any also the sense of goal that you knew that you want to discover something new, or it was more like a process?
Well, I mean, I was ambitious in a way that actually fed into the panic disorder, because what had happened, I think, is I sort of had the idea is that I would kind of earn my way into being part of the group, which I think is very common. The thing we yearn for the most is to be part of a group, is to be able to support. And it was not, some I can understand it as, in terms of where I came from, but I think I have compassion for the person who made those choices, but they weren't the right choices. Now, I'm still hardworking, but I'm not ambitious in the same way. I kind of deeply believe that we will all be forgotten soon enough. And life is very short. I can tell you that as a 74-year-old man. But I kind of came out of that panic part and then in the early ACT part, really believing as though we should think of life as a game. It's a game that we're playing. We're not trying to earn anything. There's no prize at the end. There's no finish line. And so what do you plan for? And if you play it the right way, you can sort of say, look, I'm not playing for self-acceptance. I already handled that. I'm not playing for belonging. I've already handled that. So what do you plan for? Well, for a values-based journey. This is not immortality. It's not a castle in the sky. It's not that you're so great and grand. It's just trying to do something that will be there for your children's children's children. And of course, they won't know. When I'm giving workshops, I say, name all your great-grandparents, their full names, including their maiden names. And 1 out of 100 people can do it, which means your children's children's children won't even know your name. So we're not playing for immortality. We're playing for making a difference in the stream of life. And when you're there and you sort of inhale meaninglessness, you sort of inhale the fact you're going to be forgotten, you're going to die. This is not about you being great and grand. And you take that on, then you can play pretty hard. because what do you have to lose? Nothing. Ha ha ha. So I've been playing pretty hard, maybe even too much in those. It's now 47 books, not 37, and those 680 scientific articles. But so you asked the question of, did I know? No, I didn't know but it would be like, did you know that you were going to win that tennis match when you were facing, somebody who could hit 100-mile-an-hour tennis ball? People will say, "Oh, I had confidence." Yeah, but I would say that too. But what does confidence mean? It means having the fidens part is a Latin word. It means faith. It means fidelity, and the con part means with. And so, yeah, I've been sort of with faith that it's a worthy game, not with conviction that I'm going to win the game or that it's about me at all. One of the wonderful things about that is when you play it that way, people come. And so I never let myself, I think you might even said that I developed ACT. I said I originated ACT, but I didn't develop ACT.
Yeah, I remember the metaphor.
People developed ACT.
Yeah. That you gave a spark. That's
I spark. I lit a little fire. Other people brought the logs. It's not my bonfire. It is a bonfire.
It's also beautiful that this is a journey, like together with others.
Yeah, and it's continuing. And some of the best minds come when you don't grab and say, me, my, mine. Even the word originator, I didn't allow to be used until I wrote The Story of Origin in that book that's over my shoulder of A Liberated Mind. I never used the word. I would say co-developer, but not even originator. But it's true. I did originate ACT. I originated RFT. But the community has developed those things. So I'm proud of that, and we've been on a journey together.
And it's a Polish version of Liberated Mind also.
I
it's published by GWP.
Thank you for mentioning it.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's like share those informations, this approach. Like I think that it help other. Yeah, so it's great that we have it in Polish too.
Oh no, I've been very impressed with what's going on in Poland among the community there. Very thoughtful work, and we had hoped to have our World Congress there before COVID trashed it, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get back. I hope so. We being the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, the kind of ACTI group. But I enjoy interacting with Polish professionals because of the degree of thoughtfulness and care, and people really do try to study and read and understand. And also, I have a sense that the culture and community is not shy or just complying. There's very always. What about this? What about that? What about that? Which is, I think, very healthy and good for the world.
And how do you think ACT developed, and what are the future way of development the ACT?
Yeah, ACT is a bit of a Trojan horse. I used to say ACT is the Trojan horse to bring in RFT, and RFT is the Trojan horse to bring in a functional, contextual, behavioral approach that can get over the mountain of language and cognition, including its evolutionary science brethren, because it's part of that. The expression that's there now is process-based therapy, or just a process-based approach. It's not a new form of therapy. It's a new way of thinking about evidence-based therapy. And I think ACT is in this very interesting situation where it's been pushing on a door, and now the door is fully opened. It's sort of in the room. And the question is, where do you want to take it? Unlike a lot of the methods out there, there's no trademarking, there's no certifications, there's no anointings, there's no tithing to founders. It's up to us. There's no one person who can say what ACT is or isn't. It's a group development project.
It's flexible.
It's flexible and it's going in many ways. But not only that, the science keeps expanding. And on processes of change, which was always the focus, really, that's why there's 20 years of silence. Not complete silence, but relative silence. Yeah. From the first workshop in 82 to the text in 1999. And for me, the first randomized trial after the early ones done just to make sure that what I was doing was useful, only one of which published so that my first doctoral student could get a job. A tiny little study done at the Center for Cognitive Therapy in Philadelphia with the help of Tim Beck, Rob Zettel's dissertation. The next randomized trial for me is Bach and Hayes 2002. So that's 20 years later.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of preparation for the day when the door would open. And then the door opened and there was a lot of fighting and no, third wave, blah, 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 blah. But now everybody knows third wave happened. And basically all of those issues are now central to evidence-based therapy. Everybody knows mindfulness, values, acceptance, sense of all of those things are important. Nobody disagrees. Well, but now that has opened a different door of what if people really view you as being central and even mainstream? Where do you want to go with that? Well, I've always been in a vision that's not about, here's the garden wall around this thing called ACT, but more like trying to push the boundaries of a transdiagnostic approach that's so radically transdiagnostic, it's not even transdiagnostic. I mean, it's as much about prosperity as it is about problems. I mean, people are winning gold medals at the Olympics using ACT. So in what sense is it for mental disorders? It's not for that. It's for human functioning.
Beyond it.
And then you get to the point, which like we just published this study, which we jokingly call the Death Star study in behavior research and therapy, where we looked at every mediational study ever done in the history of the world for mental health problems in a randomized trial that did a legitimate mediational analysis that then was replicated.
Mm-hmm.
And we find that more than 50% of all the successful mediators are psychological flexibility, including mindfulness, which is sort of part of that concept. And then the additional ones are very friendly. I mean, anxiety, sensitivity, self-compassion, self-efficacy, all of these things are easily fit in the idea of healthy variation around affect, cognition, attention, sense of self, motivation, overt behavior, or sociocultural and biophysiological processes that are important, like social support, relationships that work, a therapeutic alliance, or diet, sleep, and exercise. Well, you asked the question of where I want to take it is continue a process-based journey. Take the psychological flexibility model and expand it from the hexagon to the extended evolutionary meta model that's inside process-based therapy, which is thinking of healthy variation that's selected and retained and fitted to context in all those dimensions and levels I've mentioned. And when you do that, 95% of everything that we know as reflected by mediational studies that are legitimately done are inside the extended psychological flexibility model. Well, there's a challenge because now ACT is like a balloon that grew to the point where everything is inside it. So I don't know. It's going to be a real challenge for the community. I think the way it'll be is ACT will be a name for a very broad approach that will allow you to use almost any evidence-based method but with a set of core assumptions and a solid philosophical foundation and a focus on processes. And long run, that probably means that act qua act, as distinct from other things, will gradually get less and less, because in a way, act is going to get more and more. That's never happened in the history of psychological interventions. And I don't know what it'll look like, but I have some ideas. And if it means that act disappears because it's just the eggplant that ate Chicago, if it's the one thing that just became, so what? I mean, people will be helped and professionals will be empowered. So if we end up being so successful, you have a hard time finding a place where we're not there. And we have to have a different name for that, like evidence-based therapy.
It's spread on every therapies, evidence-based. Yeah,
we're not there. We're far away from there. But meanwhile, I'm trying to build alliances with not just inside CBT. That's really, really happening. But how about the Peter Fonagy's of the world? Mentalization is a real process. It's helpful. And mentalization-based therapy is evidence-based. It's not CBT. It comes out of an analytic model. Emotion-focused therapy.
Yes.
Building on Gestalt therapy, and then both, whether Sue Johnson's or Les Greenberg's.
And what do you think about
I really love that. I relate to it. And in fact, by the way, it has roots in contextual behavioral thinking. Almost nobody knows that. But way, 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 way back, the origins of Gestalt therapy included rat-running behavior analysts who were contextualistic. Ralph Hefferlein, very first Gestalt text. He's a rat runner. If people don't know that, they need to. So on and on it goes. Yeah.
And what do you think? What's your thoughts on, for example, integrating ACT to now after our conversation? I don't know, is it a good to say that it's an integration, but for example, the contextual schema therapy where there is mixed schema therapy is also integrative therapy when we have a part of the Gestalt, CBT, and psychodynamic approach, and now also ACT. Yeah.
Well, there's already whole books on integrating ACT and schema therapy, and well, here's one worry I have.
Yeah.
The ACT community after all, the main society of developing it doesn't even have the word ACT in it. It's the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. And that's not true of most of the alternatives. Most of the alternatives that are out there, evidence-based therapies, have certification. They have founders. They have societies that are named after the founders or after the particular approach. And so it might be a little harder because, of course, you can integrate in the way that therapists have always integrated. You take some of what you know about how to intervene from here and here and here, and you apply it to the person. And the deep secret of all those randomized trials in evidence-based therapy is no clinicians left to their own devices follow the protocols.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
I'll say none. It's a big lie. And then the researchers say, oh my God, how do we make them follow it? Get a life. They're not going to follow it. Why? Because your stupid protocol doesn't fit the complexity of individuals. Some people already have strengths that are in the areas that are in your protocol. Why would you waste sessions working on it? Other people have dramatic weaknesses in particular areas that require that you draw from other things. Now, but we also know this. The amount of time that you're a therapist doesn't predict how effective you are.
Yeah.
That's a fact. That's unlike almost any area in life. Almost any area in life, the more experience you have, the better you get. So why is that? Well, I think the reason is that even experienced clinicians are focused on the wrong things And so they don't get the natural feedback that shapes their effectiveness. So if you're going to be eclectic, don't be vapid eclecticism. Oh, I'll just do a little bit and make a big stew with everything thrown in it. No, you better figure out a way to do things that are linked to some sort of analytic model and feedback on whether or not those steps make sense, that are immediate and reliable to shape your behavior to be better at being able to combine ingredients to fit the person. Well, that's process-based therapy. That's what we're doing right now. And we're right now developing the tools that will allow you empirically, not just conceptually. You kindly mentioned learning process-based therapy. Yeah, but we're headed now towards empirical tools, high-density longitudinal measures, statistical methods. We literally, in the last month, have invented new statistical methods that are just awesome. I mean, we're moving so fast right now on PBT, and I get up excited every day at what's happening. But coming back to your question, if you take an example of schema therapy, let's say, if we're going to integrate it, if we're going to put it on a process-based journey, can our colleagues there, and we're actually doing a special issue of a journal and invite some of our major people to do this, can they get really specific about the processes of change? I would like them to try to fit it to the aim, because if you can't think of what you're doing in an evolutionary way, healthy variation that's selected and retained, fitted to context, I wonder why not, since it's the one theory in life science without which the life sciences don't make sense. So we'll see. So far, I mean, people seem to be stepping up to it and say, yeah, I could do that. Okay, well, when we've done that, now can we not integrate in the sense of just grabbing things off the shelf because instinct tells us, but now looking at networks of processes of change applied to the individual, assessed empirically, but also not just self-report, wearables, other things, behavior, but also just our functional and analytic skills, so that it's a true integration. Now, warning to those who want to play that way, it does mean you can't build castles in the sky. You can't have a little wall around your castle and say, thou shalt only enter when you pay me $300 for the first level of certification. It's just not going to work that way, gang. I'm sorry. You'll make plenty of money. Don't worry about it. You'll be famous. It's okay. But, and I'm not saying this, I am saying a little bit with an attitude. Forgive me for that. People are trying to do good. They're trying to say, let's make sure you do it right, because I know I've tested it, and if you do that, that will work. I mean, the Marshall Linehans of the world and all the rest, that's what they did. But in the long run, what's left behind, when the founders die, let's just say that, what we would hope is that the processes that are important, that are inside these methods, can come into the work of clinicians so they know when to draw kernels out of schema or DBT or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mentalization-based therapy or EFT, or on and on it goes. When we get there, we will have transformed the world, because these processes aren't just for mental disorders. They're for mental health. They're for behavioral health. They're for human prosperity. So they should be in our schools. They should be in our businesses. They should be in our church groups. They should be. So it isn't just the therapists. Once we're there, the therapists will be
preventing.
Preventing. And maybe, like if you really knew that these kernels under these conditions would be helpful. And if you had tools that would actually tell you that. And if the kernels are the kind of things that your neighbor could even talk to you about, why wouldn't we be putting this into what teachers do? Or what the foreman or foreperson, that was a non-sexist way of saying foreman, at your factory does. Or your priest or minister or rabbi or imam. Why not? And we have been very active in the ACT community. You can be a member of our society regardless of your background. We don't care.
Yeah,
If
I
you
know
want
it.
to learn how to use these
Open.
methods and apply them in your context in an appropriate way, that doesn't mean everybody's a therapist. I just mean that mental health is not about 1 out of 5 people. It's about 5 out of 5 people. And who doesn't know that after these 2 years of COVID? And it's not 1 hour a week for 50 minutes or whatever, one day a week for 50 minutes. It's 24/7.
Yeah.
So you can't think of all of that just in terms of evidence-based therapy. We have to think of that in terms of empowerment processes that we can put into human lives.
Yeah, and those are very important things now because of, for example, the war on the Ukraine that is very close to us, and the crisis for example, in Poland, refugees crisis, the energetic crisis. Yeah.
Well, and the refugees sometimes come having experienced major losses, having given up a lot to do that. They're under huge stress. They're in a foreign country, a different country, speaking a different language, and we have heart for them. We allow people in, but then we have to do more. And, I'm beating the drums for things like the only evidence-based method that the World Health Organization deploys for war refugees like that. It's radically transdiagnostic, which is that program called Self-Help Plus, which is written by Russ Harris and is a flat-out ACT protocol.
Yeah, I did a podcast
good
based
evidence
on
in randomized trials that it's helpful. So right now in the Ukraine, Self-Help Plus is being deployed, and I've been in communication with there's not an ACBS chapter there, but there is a CBT chapter. It's part of the World Congress, and with the president there of that chapter, and I've been reaching out to the to the officials in the Ministry of Health in the Ukraine, and trying to the ACT community is making it available free. We gave. And I was part of raising the money for this, scholarships to everybody in the in Ukraine or any nearby country, including Poland, to be able to come to the World Conference for free. And 60 some people took us up on that and attended the conference virtually for free. So, yeah, that's an example of how we have to step up and put these tools into people's hands. I mean, you can go, there's a bit.ly link, you know how bit.ly works, bit.ly/. If you just do that and then type in all capitals WHO and then the underline and then ACT, you'll be on the page where you can download the book and the audio tapes.
Oh, yes, I downloaded it, yeah.
And anybody can use these things, and they're available in Polish, and it's not what you would, it's not a full course of psychotherapy and all of that, but it turns out it's pretty helpful. It has effect sizes about 0.3 and at follow-up. Initial effect size is more like 0.5.
Yeah.
On almost any form of psychological distress that you can measure. And it has a 50% reduction in the development of mental disorders if you don't have one, compared to treatment is pretty good treatment as usual.
So it shows also how psychological flexibility is a factor of developing the trauma.
Well, and not only do you know that it moves, but the World Health Organization series of studies now has a mediational analysis that was accepted last week at the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology. I don't know who the first author is, but I know that my friend Ross White is one of the authors. So very soon you can go to the JCCP or APA website and see the mediational analysis, and what mediated, from what I'm told, psychological flexibility. So we know a lot about what the targets should be for people who are facing these potentially traumatizing experiences. That's a huge step forward. because it asks of the entire behavioral health, mental health, behavioral science community, target these processes. I don't care if you call it ACT. You can call it Uncle Fred the Wonder Slug. Fine. Target them, change them, track it, measure it, and help people, walk through these extreme challenges of the modern world, whether it's the Ukrainian war or what our young people are facing with climate change and realizing that, shoot, we screwed it up so bad, they're wondering if they should have kids.
Yeah.
That's just 2 problems we picked. We could do this for like 12 problems.
Yeah,
So
we can multiply because it's more and more problems with inflation, economical
problems with diversity, racial bias, etc. I mean, we're still paying the sins. Yeah. It's in our hearts and heads of, our racist background across the world, for example. And just because you say, "Oh, I'm not a racist," no, dude, you've got the categorical concepts in your head that were put there by Galton and Fisher and Carl Pearson. And who are these people? Eugenicists. Yeah. Our very tools for how we measure people. Oh, I got a high IQ. Oh, my child has a low IQ. That doesn't predict their future. Yeah, it does not. It's a mathematical false pretense that comes out of Galton trying to figure out who should have children. So, and by the way, the answer was always white upper class people. Duh. Of course that was the answer. So the kids are in a different world. The young people, and you're young enough, actually, well, you're not a kid, but you're younger than I am. We have for the first time a generation that grew up with these rocket ships, 1,000 times more powerful than what landed people on the moon. It's in your pocket.
Yeah.
And you can see anything going on around the world in seconds. And that means you're going to see more pain, you're going to hear more comparisons, and you're going to be encouraged to experientially avoid more. Those 3 together predict misery, prejudice, and lack of enjoyment to be around other people. But you also have a tool in your pocket that allows you to connect in consciousness with almost anybody on the planet within minutes, to create community around these issues. And yeah, we're going to have to manage the cultural impact, but let's get about doing it and put, these values-based processes of learning how to be more open, engaged, and aware that liberate human minds. And if we do that as therapists, if we serve and help kind of create modern minds for the modern world, then we won't have to just listen to some engineer when they're talking about climate change. There'll be a psychologist there talking about the psychology of climate change, or we won't have to, just rely on, the politicians to deal with immigration.
So it's always our behavior at the end and on the beginning too.
Our problems are behavioral problems. We have enough food for everybody. We do. Just do the math. We have enough food for everybody. Take any of these problems. We have enough for everybody. But we have these behavioral barriers. And we see in our politics and so forth how challenging it is psychologically to change this fast. And some people are saying, no, just build the wall, keep them out. Okay, I understand that urge, but how are you going to keep out the rest of the world? Putin may think he's keeping them out with, his restrictions on the media. Now, kids are working around the firewalls. Of course they are. Not everybody, probably not the old folks. They don't have the skills to move through it. The kids do.
Yeah, now I see. In the past, when my dad he had the old Nokia phone, and when he wanted to check something or to text someone, he was slowly wearing glasses firstly, then open it. Then for 5 minutes he wanted to type something. I was like, okay, okay, faster, faster. And now I feel like when I fall into a clinical work, I don't have a time to use social media or cell phone. And now I feel like I'm taking phone sometimes. I want to, sometimes I have to post something on social media, and I feel like my dad at 20 years ago when he was like tapping, so it shows how um, my losing touch with technology was not big, but for maybe like a couple of years, and how it changed. Yeah.
Yeah, we're now into a thing where a generational change, a profound one, is a 10-year deal. I mean, this world is, just wait until the robots are walking around. If you don't think 10 years from now robots are walking around doing your manual labor, wake up. Wake up. Of course they are. Oh, they barely walked when he came out on AI Day and Tesla. Dude, look at free self-driving for the freaking car. It can go from 500 miles without a single intervention. If you can do that, of course you can put the same stack of navigating the world. It is the same stack. I'm kind of looking at what Elon's doing. The world that is coming is a radically, radically, radically different world. AI, I mean, part of the hostile impact of this has become because AI tools are figuring out how Google and Facebook and the rest can feed prejudice and other things to milk time. Eyeballs equal money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's had a dramatic effect on our politics, and we can see that it's not all good. Yeah, but AI is doing a whole lot of other things. And, you don't have to be a, crazy hair on fire futurist to understand that change is coming at a spectacular rate. I mean, half the cars we're driving will be electric vehicles within a handful of years. A handful.
Yeah.
And that's just an example. It's not like, oh, that matters in and of itself. No, it matters because, of course, electrification of everything is coming. Of course, it's going to be solar and wind. And so what? That's it. Because it's so what? Because it's just the tip of the spear of a massive change in everything. And I will say to the therapist, here's what I think's coming. You will be more like a cyborg. We need the human being. We're not going to do chat bots as therapists. Some of that will be out there.
They replace humans.
I don't think that's going to happen. But what you need is something that is bumping you in a right direction. Let me give you an example. We did a study, we being Gerhard Andersen's shop there in Sweden, showing that by session 2 or 3, the talk of people in therapy who are in an ACT protocol predicted follow-up outcomes if you measured the degree of diffusion in the talk. Okay. We now have methods where we can record at 98 to 99% reliably a psychotherapy session and turn it into text such that when you say goodbye to your patient, you can get the transcript. We have algorithms already that will score that transcript in terms of the amount of self-oriented talk, emotionally avoidant-oriented talk, diffusion-oriented talk.
Wow.
We have grants that are in place right now that will allow you, when you walk out of the therapy session and soon enough in therapy, to be able to get feedback on the change of the processes that you're seeing in your client by what they said.
The way they change the way of speaking during the session.
Yes, even the paralinguistic cues, the tone of voice. Is it a stress-related sentence? Is it the loudness of it, and so on? No. Is this available right now? I can give you the app. No, but I can point you to the research that's going on.
Yeah.
And I can point you to the other areas where AI has landed. And of course, AI is going to land inside psychotherapy. So what do you, and I have an app that within 4 to 5 months will allow you to do, I think, case conceptualization using the PBAT and the PsychFlex.
Yeah.
And if you can get clients to use it for about a month, that's not convenient. But you have
Professor Hoffman also, he works.
Rochi and I, the process-based assessment tool.
Great.
It'll be available in Polish, by the way.
I hope so.
As soon as the methods are translated, which are not complicated, there's not that many. Well, I'm getting a little hyper here, but what I'm saying is, one of the cool things about a process-based focus that comes out of ACT and this ability to make it ideographic, which is important, and the changes that are coming in the world, is that the culture now no longer wants a song about who's abnormal and who's normal. Do you know, if you have a book on psychopathology, you can't call it abnormal psychology anymore?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that? There are no texts in abnormal psychology.
Yeah.
Why? Because the kids won't buy the book. If it says abnormal psychology, they won't buy the book. Why? Because the entire culture is fed up with normal.
Yeah, this is there's look at the science that there is nothing that we can call normal because everyone is different and
everyone is different. Turns out that's right. That's right. So now we're going to need the ideographic, or I call them idionomic. Why idionomic? Because they have to be ideographic within the person over time. But then, yes, of course, we can't have just the psychology of the one. We have to look to see what are the processes we know about, and also look to see how is this unique person like others. Because if I can see that, then I can say, oh, do I see something when I realize the commonalities? If I do, then I come over and say, now does it help me model the individual even better?
Yeah.
So the individual becomes what, sacrosanct. I don't mean the individual cut off from the social group. It could be the individual couple, the individual family, the individual organization. But I mean the unit that you're looking at becomes sacrosanct, and the group becomes the source of error. It's upside down statistics. And those statistical methods are available, but we're developing at rapid speed. And I say we, Stefan, Joe, myself especially, Joe in this case especially. When you start thinking no longer in terms of columns with people as rows, but in terms of rows, when you sort of create this horizontal world,
change the view,
you see things that are just not there. And big data, AI, machine learning, all of those folks have been on that journey. That's why they can tweak your feed to feed you. They know how to reach you.
Yeah.
Well, how about if the therapist knew how to reach you? So what I mean by therapists as cyborgs is that you will have statistical and empirical aids in being able to read the ideographic individual in a more network-based way so that you can target your interventions almost moment to moment to fit the psychology of the individual.
Yeah, it's also amazing and
full of years away. So some of the tools will be available next year, and in a way that you really would say, "Oh yeah, for sure." I think one hand would be needed to count the years, and I'm working as hard as I can. I mean, I'm president of a charitable organization that's developing an app and spending money at an incredible rate to do that. So I'm hopeful because we're either going to go bankrupt or we'll have the tool.
Yeah. Hope we don't. We'll have enough money to cover all of those great studies and work. And
I've been doing rants here, my friend. I mean, I'm creating a little bit of a chaos for you. What in here do you want me to focus on as we come closer to an hour? We can go longer, but
it's up to you. Is it if you have some more time?
If you have some places you want to explore, and
it's for me. It's okay. There is a session in the other room, but they are also silent. But it's okay. Thank you.
What do you think your listeners would want to explore? I presume you can edit.
Yeah, I think that the other part of the the psychotherapy would change, and I saw that you will be have a talk about implementing into the act the psychedelics. Yeah, and it's very also, I think, interesting topic, and it could be controversial. I saw that there was already research in, I think, in Great Britain into the treatment of the depression, but it's very interesting. And what's your thoughts on the implementing psychedelics into the psychotherapy? How it could enhance?
I think psychedelic assisted therapy is going to be huge. It's going to be huge. Why? Because I think we can already see the effect sizes are quite large, number one. Number two, the processes of change that are involved are very interesting and are very supportive of where we've been going in evidence-based therapy, especially in the ACT community. Psychological flexibility, mindfulness, and some of these transformational kind of spiritual moments, oceanic awareness, a sense of oneness across time, place, and person, and so forth. And unlike lots of the medications that we've been using that have severe side effects, sometimes if they're high dose and long term, sometimes lifelong side effects in terms of permanent modification of the nervous system. Instead, we're looking at the possibility of 1 or 2 doses. There is the microdosing work, but I don't think the data are very supportive there. And there's some early evidence that it's probably more really a placebo effect. But if you're dosing once or twice and you're using it to do what? To create a connection with psychological processes that can transform your life. What are those? Well, I don't think it's going to be brand new. They're the processes that we've already been incrementally working on with our acceptance and mindfulness and values-based work, especially the things that are in that large meta-analysis or systematic review of it, mediational studies. So people are inviting me to be part of that effort, and I'm happily agreeing. I was on a conversation with a team writing a grant an hour ago, and helping them to do high-density longitudinal measures, because I think we need to look more idiographically, and to create a process-based protocol to prepare and to integrate after the dosing sessions. ACT is being used a lot, and one of the major models out there is called the ACE model, which is simply a rearranging by Jason Luomo, a former president of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, who has a randomized trial right now, an MDMA trial, a rearranging of the psychological flexibility model to fit these dominant processes of acceptance and connection that are there in the early psychedelic trials. The reason I'm so excited, in addition to the fact that, yes, we can talk in terms of medications and the biologizing of our culture, that's not a bad thing, but now in a way that isn't like, here are the medications you have to take for the next 2 years and your nervous system will be permanently different. And with side effects that are pretty unattractive. If we can do it to almost, catch lightning in a bottle, to be able to see, because of how quickly transformation can happen, to be able to see what is underneath what has happened to human beings when this evolutionary recent adaptation of analytic judgmental language, that's only 200,000 to 2 million years old, harnesses part of your brains that are 1,000 times older and starts filtering out sensory and sensory motor information so dramatically you don't even know what world you live in. You're living inside your narrative. And with a little help of the right medications and with a little bit of guidance, I think, of the process focus, which indigenous peoples have been doing forever inside their metaphorical spiritual journeys, or however they do it in their religious side. If you unpack what's in there, what's in those orientations that were there with indigenous peoples are orientation as to how to make sense of your own emotions and thoughts and focus on what's important. So with a guide, this is the kind of spiritual. Well, we're not going to do it probably in Western culture or in modern culture by, having shamans in the Amazon guide us through a dosing, but they're going to look to the therapist. And where we need to look, I think, is on processes of change that are validated, not just in psychedelic assisted therapy, but also there. Look at the ones that are resonant, make sense, fit with a theory, and help people prepare to look at those processes. And I'm especially excited about the ones that are in sense of self, values, these more transformational spiritual awakenings. ACT, after all, starts off with, you could say, a transformational or even spiritual moment inside my own panic disorder. It's in my TED Talk.
Yeah, I remember.
So wouldn't it be cool if we can really guide the culture of how to use medications to open the door to psychological power processes that empower the development of people? And we'll do it initially for depression, for anxiety, for PTSD.
For DSM.
We'll do that. But soon enough, it'll be for relationships, for leadership, for business, sports performance, for stepping up to the challenge of a cancer diagnosis. It'll be for everything, because these processes are those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I heard that also they, according to relationships, that the micro dosages, they can strengthen the therapeutic relationship during the session. Like creating openness. And that's what I know from those studies.
Well, the therapeutic relationship is another means to the same end. I think we model, instigate, and support psychological flexibility and mindfulness in a therapeutic relationship that is well done, that we show in our behavior with our clients that we are deeply accepting of them as people. We're attentive to them. We're with them consciously. It's a conscious connection between two human beings. We don't judge them. We teach them how not to judge themselves harshly. And we focus on what they deeply care about. And we are willing to be there and show in our commitment to them and to the how they could commit in a way to their own values-based journey. Well, those are the flexibility processes. And when you internalize the therapeutic relationship, that's when change happens. The dirty secret of the therapeutic alliance data is that it doesn't tell you how to have good ones.
There's no.
And almost everybody, when they look at it, say, "Oh, now I see." If you have a plan that you agree on, and you have a empowering stance. No, because if that were true in the sense that if you just knew that it was helpful, since I don't know any therapists who haven't heard that rap, and I don't know almost any therapists who don't believe that therapeutic alliance is important. I just don't know of any. It must mean that that alone is not helpful because half of the therapists are below average. Think about it. Half of the therapists are below average. So the reason why these correlations work is that people who believe in the therapeutic alliance and even know what it contains are below average.
Yeah.
If everybody knows it and half are below average, and the reason why it predicts is because the ones that are above average do better, it must mean that knowing it is not enough. Well, then what is enough? Well, then where are the randomized trials, dude? When we went to the therapeutic alliance in our big study, we found one FAP study, one ACT plus FAP study, one DBT study, and one CBT study. That's it. Actually, we reported 5 because we made an error. We're going to have to publish the error. It turns out we said there were 5. There's only 4. There's a detail of the method that we missed, unfortunately. There's one error in those 281 studies that we found so far, and we're going to publish a correction in the journal. But if you can't show mediation, that means you don't know how to produce the thing that you're say is important, while it's still being important in both arms of the study. That's what mediation means. It means in the control group or in the intervention group, it predicts outcomes, but you move it more in the treatment arm, right? That's what mediation means if you unpack the statistics.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have mediators, but you have this massive amount where people are saying it's everything, it's the alliance, it must mean you don't know how to produce it.
And what does it
Well,
mean?
How is that helpful to therapists? Is it there for self-soothing? Oh, I care about the alliance. If caring about the alliance was enough, all therapists would be above average.
Yeah. It means that you could just talk to someone in the very friendly way, caring, and that's all, without any other modeling or shaping.
That miserable data, that amount of experience doesn't predict outcomes. Because, of course, some people are really, really good at creating alliances and so forth. And so you have a therapist effect. If I can create alliance with a person over here, it predicts more over here. Yeah, but again, how does that help therapists?
Yeah.
Other than just sorting them into the good ones and the bad ones. I thought we were about training, aren't we?
Yeah.
You think it's just inborn? If it's just inborn, why don't we just assess everybody and then give them a license? And if we assess you and you're not good at it, you're out.
Yeah.
Okay. You want to run your healthcare system that way? Go for it. I don't know a country in the world that's done that. It might work. Grandma could be a, instant therapist. Boom. She's really good at creating alliances. I don't think people have thought through that this means, I'm going on a rant about therapeutic alliance because the people who sing the song the most sometimes are kind of hostile to, experimental evidence, but they also want to be paid. And if you really believe the therapeutic alliance and you believe it's a therapist effect and you believe that it's almost inborn, why are we paying therapists? Why don't we just go out and find people on the street who are really good at creating alliances?
Yeah.
And when you're getting paid $15 an hour for your precious license, you'll wonder whether or not that was a good idea. So I don't know. It's a little bit of a cynical way to say it, but I do think it's the devolution of our field if we can't figure out. Now, I can say as an ACT person, I know something about how to do that. Why? Because if you do multiple mediator models, in one of the studies that showed, one of 4, that the working alliance mediated outcomes, if you put in the client's psychological flexibility, it sucked all the variance out of the therapeutic alliance, which doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It means it's a means to that end.
It's more like a field to build a house, like not to only like that we can live on grass, but it's like something that our client needs to feel that he can open himself, like to create the space that we can feel and share our the most intimate thoughts and
people become more self-accepting because they see in the relationship that your therapist doesn't go, oh my God, you felt that? Oh. No matter how painful it is, or odd or whatever, you're going to lean in and listen and hang in there with them. People need to do that. When they do that and internalize it, I think if we look more deeply, like there was a big meta-analysis published in the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science showing if you look at parenting and intimate relationships, psychological flexibility predicted both healthy relationship behaviors in those two domains and greater satisfaction with relationships in those two domains. Part of what's going on, I think, is as people internalize these processes, they not only do things that are healthy for themselves in the sense of no longer avoiding when it's unnecessary or disappearing in rumination and worry or all the other inflexibility places you can go. They start doing things that create social support. They create relationships and community in their homes, in their families, in their job, and then, we're the social primates. We need that. And so even if you're doing individual therapy, it's a social process. And when it's internalized, it becomes a social process after therapy in the person's life as a social being. So that's another reason why I think psychological flexibility functions well as a mediator, is because the long-term outcomes are being impacted not just by the individual therapy you're doing, but by the group that's being created and altered by the same processes that the person then is putting into their lives.
Great. And also my what I notice in here that some of the clinicians, they have experiential avoidance, I think, for RFT. And my question is, because on the one of your interviews you said that this is it's the heart of the act for you, and how to know the RFT can enhance our therapeutic work, for example. What we can benefit from, like to maybe pay more attention to understand RFT.
Well, there's no experimental evidence that studying RFT necessarily makes you better, but there's some indications. But there's also this. Okay, so let me just very quickly walk through the arc about why we know. If you look at children who can't derive arbitrarily applicable relations, they can't do stimulus equivalence, stimulus exclusion, opposites, comparisons, time, etc. These are disabled children, you can do a really good job of functional analysis by just looking at what the specific reinforcers are for their problematic behavior. As soon as they develop even the simplest forms of derived relational responding, which is the simplest form is just the bidirectional relation between a referent and the object, between a word and its referent. The ability to determine what the consequences are of importance of problematic behavior falls by 3.5 times. It doesn't disappear, but it plummets with the tiniest little bit. We are the social primates who evolved a form of cooperation where you could request objects from afar and have them be provided to you, which massively increased our capacity to cooperate. That was already there in our hunting practices and our tool use and all the rest. Hominins were doing this, I'm almost certain. It isn't just Homo sapiens because of burial rituals and things like that. Maybe even before, maybe Australopithecus, etc. But all the homos, the 13 different hominins, I think probably, were doing this to a degree. When you then are able to not just be able to refer something and bidirectionally create the relationship, which no non-human animal has reliably shown. Not reliably been shown with a single non-human animal that's been replicated with a procedure that's accepted by the field. As you add, for example, just time and comparison, simplest little relations, you now can do problem solving in your head. But that means you can also do problem creation in your head. If I do this, then I'll get that, and that's better than this in your head. And so if you take something like the most spectacularly dysfunctional thing that we know, people killing themselves, 2-year-olds don't kill themselves. 1-year-olds don't kill themselves. 4 and 5-year-olds kill themselves. The first act book was about a 6-year-old. The very first words in the first act text is a 6-year-old child threw herself in front of a train today. The authorities said her mother had died from a terminal illness. And why is it in there? Because I'm saying the stuff we're struggling with and trying to change is based on such simple cognitive processes that even, a preschooler can imagine that it'll be better to be in heaven with mom than to live life without her and throw herself in front of a train. So all of the flexibility processes emerge out of thinking of cognition as early, as learned. Therefore, it's not going to be unlearned, and as transformational in its impact, where a positive can become a negative, before can become after, big can become little. I mean, how old were you when you learned in your coinage, which you probably have what we have here, children learns that a nickel is smaller than a dime. 3-year-olds don't like that. 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds can do it. Where it's now no longer bound by size. A dime is smaller. No, a dime is bigger. But if that's true, you can also say, I was so successful, but I should have been more. What was that movie recently of that robber baron? I'm blocking on the guy who has billions, an early robber baron, and in the movie they ask him, what is it going to take for you to be happy? And he says, more. This is the human condition. And so, the reason why we need RFT is that we need a relatively adequate account of higher language and cognition that is basic enough that we can do the work to understand the processes that give rise to these psychological processes at a higher level. And when we went from behavior therapy and contingency thinking to cognitive behavior therapy, we added cognition, but without that, we didn't have that. So we just asked our clients what they thought. We categorized it into rational or irrational, blah, blah, blah. They're horrible mediators. Horrible. I mean, that's the dirty secret of CBT, is that the reason why classic CBT stumbled is that the elements that were predicted by the model and the mediation by the model over and over again didn't work very well. Well, but when you think about it from an RFT point of view and then put it into processes, they work pretty well. Now, here's the thing I say to clinicians, though. RFT is a really heavy lift. We're trying to understand human cognition and language. For goodness sakes, this is a 100-year process, but we're making progress. How do we know that? We can raise people's IQ. We can take people who don't talk and help them to talk. We can teach people in the cognitive relations that lead to a sense of self, and then a sense of self emerges. We can increase their mind skills. So when people tell me, oh, it's not based on RFT because there's no tight connection, but I'm saying, dudes, look at the things we can do when we target what I would call just relational operants, relational learning as a learned but extraordinarily human process that started in cooperation and is now used for problem solving, which has created problems for us that we unpack in therapy. Now, if you're a therapist saying, why should I know this? It would be like, one thing, it would be like why you study brain science. Even though it's not going to tell you necessarily what to do, but you can understand how the amygdala works and a little bit about why trauma is having a long-term impact and
to understand
how the vagal system changes and people are freezing right in front of you like a lizard on the lawn because you walked in and you're scary, and they have a history such that the whole body starts shutting down. Look, does that help? I mean, most people would say, yeah, that helps. I really understand. But can I say, and now based on that, here's the specific things you should do? The answer is yes, but it's a small set. I'll give you one yes. Okay, one yes.
Okay.
A witnessing, noticing sense of self is fundamental to the ACT model. Self as context, we call it. The tripart relation analysis of self that's based in RFT, way ahead of the game. It was in the very, very first article about RFT and ACT, only 3 years after mine Out on the Carpet, Making Sense of Spirituality, 1984, 2 years after the first ACT workshop. So really early on idea. Well, when you're sort of this noticing sense of self, you can think of in two ways. One is, I'm distinct from those things that I'm noticing. And there are meditative traditions that do things like, I'm not that.
Yeah,
workshops. You know that one?
Yeah, I saw it on the ACT immersion. It's also great course.
And there's a spooky thing that sort of happens when you show up in consciousness, and then you notice the content, and then you notice that you're noticing.
Yeah.
And in the noticing that you're noticing, you notice that I'm not that.
Yeah.
It's something but it's something that's in me, with me, part of me. Well, that relation
at the same time
different. It's not one of distinction, it's one of inclusion, but in a hierarchical way.
Yeah.
So like if you take something like the chessboard analogy, that's a hierarchical metaphor.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay, so here along comes Carmen Luciano with a series of pretty tight RFT studies showing that the frame of inclusion and hierarchy is more powerful in producing diffusion effects that make an impact on behavior than a frame of distinction. So if you're just using the exercise that we stole from psychosynthesis, the observer exercise, which was early on, we just stole it outright. Forget the guy who came up with that, but where you notice things and then you keep noticing that you're noticing and therefore you're not that. And you conclude with, so all these things that you've been struggling with and trying to change are not you anyway, right? That's the observer exercise, classic ACT exercise. It's fine, it's helpful, it's good, absolutely. But if you look at the house with furniture in it, or the chessboard metaphor, or the sky with clouds in it, or all these other there are metaphors of hierarchy or inclusion. And Carmen comes along and says, you actually get more pop from those. So if you're going to do the observer exercise, don't forget to be doing the chessboard exercise and language about it in a way that all of this is going to sort of follow you through life. Your psychology, your brain, there's no delete button. It's healthy, and the nervous system is going to include all of this. That's a frame of hierarchy and inclusion. Very concrete, specific. I'll give you one more. Okay, I just gave you one that came out of RFT research that changes ACT practice that we didn't know when we wrote the first ACT book. I'll give you one more. Okay. When you're doing a metaphor, let's say the quicksand metaphor.
Yeah,
we know, and it's in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, the RFT book. I tried to write with Mathieu Villat and Jen Villat. a book that was about RFT extension to the clinical session with no ACT in it.
Yeah.
We tried, of course, it leaks. It's ACT-y, of course, because ACT was built on and with concurrently developed with RFT. Well, one of the things that are in there, if you're doing a metaphor, make sure that the ground includes perceptual, sensory descriptions that are similar between the target and the ground. Okay, so let's take the quicksand metaphor. Anxiety is like quicksand. If you struggle with it, you sink, blah, blah, blah. Turns out some of that is actually more Disneyland than real, but we don't care because most people have learned that. It's fine. Well, what would you feel like if you were in a bog and as you struggle, you start to sink? I mean, you would be breathing hard. Your heart would be pounding. You might be,
try to get out
everywhere. You'd have thoughts screaming inside your head,
Tense.
get out. And yet, if you lift your foot, you might know if you've been trained in your Boy Scouts or whatever, or just Disney movies, that if you lift your foot, you've now decreased your surface area by half. So you're going down, not up.
Yeah.
If that mud below you can only carry a certain amount of weight, you just decrease the surface area. So you're going down. Well, when I'm describing that, if I know the person, let's say, has an anxiety struggle in which it's hard for them to breathe.
Yes.
They feel confined. They have thoughts that scream to get out and run. Their heart is pounding. Well, I want to tell this metaphor, and so you're sinking down, your heart is pounding, you're starting to sweat, you have a hard time breathing, you're going deeper,
exactly like
your mind is screaming. Why would you do that? Because the perceptual connection in the ground,
the same
target, and a vehicle is the linchpin in the network that allows you to take something that's not here in this network, but is here in this network. Like in the quicksand network, you do know, you've been taught that maybe laying out flat and increasing the surface area might keep you from sinking to your death into this mud. Okay, metaphorically, what would it mean to lay out flat on top of your anxiety? That's missing in the anxiety network. It's present in the quicksand network, but you're not going to get the credibility and the connection if you don't emphasize the perceptual similarities.
The metaphor is more powerful than,
it's more powerful. It comes out of RFT.
Experiential.
So I can go through maybe 20 examples like that.
Yeah.
And there'll be more. The reason why there's not more is RFT is such a heavy lift empirically, and there's only a few labs really doing it. At the point at which the funders finally wake up that traditional cognitive science isn't the only horse to ride and start, funding basic behavior analytic labs, or maybe cognitive science labs like Jan de Houwers and in Ghent, who's a cognitive scientist who does RFT research, or maybe some of our big data AI people who are headed towards RFT at light speed.
Yeah.
I mean, relational learning.
They have enough space to handle those data of the RFT.
They probably won't know it's RFT, and we'll probably never get any credit for it, but it's fine. I don't care. Just get relational learning in there and enough that we learn how to drive it. And so that's why. But I would say to a skeptical clinician, don't worry about it. You don't have to learn RFT. Learn ACT well. If it really resonates, sooner or later, your own human curiosity will probably get you to say, why does this stuff really work? And how can I make it better?
Great.
And when you get that level of interest, you will find a very receptive community who has a lot to teach you about basic relational responding. And more is being learned every year. Can I say one more thing about the RFT thing? I mentioned to you that,
sure,
the functional analysis done as just direct contingencies plummets once you can do the least beginnings of higher cognition. Mark Dixon now has data that if you take children on the spectrum who are developmentally disabled and their cognitive skills relationally are not yet at the level of metaphor, humor, things of that kind, they cannot benefit from ACT. But if you train them to the point where they have those skills, they need ACT. So
it's comparing. Yeah.
I'll tell you a story, and then maybe we'll call this at the end of our journey, since we've been here going for 90 minutes. I was doing work with my team years ago with a person who had rudimentary language skills, was developmentally disabled, but didn't have that sense of self that comes from deictic frames of I, you, here, there, now, then. And we were teaching these perspective-taking frames. And we had a interview with a parent, and the parent, and we're saying, so have you noticed any benefits, any impact? I said, oh, yes, really wonderful progress. A spectacular thing happened last week where I dropped my plate of food, and my son said, for the first time ever, are you sad, Mommy? And she starts to tear up, and she says, he's never shown any interest in my internal world ever.
Wow.
It's the first time. Of course, we're working on perspective-taking frames, right? In the basic learning lab, right?
Yeah.
And what comes? Empathy.
Yeah.
Beginnings of empathy. There's I'm jumping to another story. I shouldn't do it, but there's a really famous ACT person, but I won't mention the person's name, who had an autistic child who was saved by RFT, basically, and now looks absolutely normal, is mainstreamed and so forth. But back in the day was in a full-time RFT program. And the first day, after months of this, working on didactics, he takes his son, puts him in the car that's going to drive him to the special RFT school in the place where he is. And he tells the story of his child looking at him from the car and waving goodbye for the first time. And he starts to cry, telling me the story. I mean, just imagine what it's like to be a parent where you're raising a child who never shows any indication that you are a conscious human being with feelings of yourself. Yeah? But now back to my first story and why I'm telling this story. She tears up. She said, oh, this is wonderful. We're feeling so good about what we're doing, man. She says, yeah, but there are some problems that are new. Well, like what? He's getting into fights at school. And he's asking strange questions. Well, like what? Well, he asked me last week, Mommy, what does tarred mean? Tarred is what children, back when this was the word that was being used, this is years ago.
Okay.
When you're the retard, you're the retarded kid. You're in special ed. And you're out on the playground with the general education kids.
Okay.
And they start calling you tarred.
Tarred, okay.
Of course, he's been called tarred his whole life.
But now he
didn't have the cognitive ability to know that they were criticizing him. And of course, he's getting in fights because we've dragged him into consciousness.
Yeah, he starts to feel
the kind of consciousness that can allow you to ask questions like, am I good enough? Am I smart enough? Am I part of the group?
This is the opposite way of the side, not way, the side of our language. Yeah.
It's the dark side.
The dark side, yeah.
And every one of us have lived that journey. Every single one of us have. And so the answer to your question about why RFT, I can point to cases like that where we need to understand the human condition. You mentioned psychedelic therapy. Why? Because these narratives, these stories are harnessing itself to these midbrain structures and literally blocking out our awareness of our own world because they don't fit the story we're telling it to ourselves. And so why mindfulness and diffusion and so forth? Because we're on the back of a tiger. We've created something that is wonderful. It gives us things like this without analytic, judgmental, problem-solving language. We wouldn't be talking across many thousands of miles in real time.
Yeah.
Even 20 years ago, we couldn't do this.
Yeah.
And today, within 10 miles of where you live, a child, somebody in the developmental period is going to commit suicide. And they will write down on their note about how they will not suffer as much when they're dead.
Yeah. And
So if we can't understand this in a really basic way, how can we create the new things that are needed? Because our mental health problems are not going down as a human society, they're going up.
They're going up, yeah. Like our civilization level, they are like one-to-one, the mental health problems and the speed and the development of our civilization.
Yeah, and in every other area of the health system, when the problem doesn't yield, eventually people go basic. When you were botanizing cancer and just saying what color it is and shape, and people were still dying at the same rate, eventually somebody wanted to figure out oncogenes.
Yeah, it doesn't help.
Or now epigenetic regulation of cell growth.
Yeah.
Why? Because then people get to live. That's why. So my friends who are therapists, we're living in a field where practice doesn't mean that you're better, and where effect sizes are not going up, they're going down. Or at least they're stable.
Mm-hmm.
So why RFT? Because we are the cognizing creatures. What have you and I been doing here for 90 minutes? And we better understand that in such a basic way that we can change the places where the mind will whisper in your ear that I'm you, and what you need to do is run, fight, freeze, or hide.
Like me last night.
We can't reach through that.
Yeah.
Our processes of change evidence says we're not going to change human lives. But I don't like saying you won't be a good ACT therapist until you know RFT. It's not true. You can learn ACT and kind of be pretty good. Yeah, sure. We have evidence that you, with 12 hours of training, you can do a pretty good job. There's actually randomized trials of 12 hours of training getting pretty good effects. So, but those of you who really want to push the envelope and help us all get better, I invite you to be interested not just in polyvagal theory or in all the other things you're into, or in emotion folk, or all the other things you're into, cognitive schemas, etc., but this really basic science of human language and cognition that has been part of the ACT journey from the beginning.
Okay, so I know it's 90 minutes, so I don't want to take more of your time, and I'm very grateful for this interview. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. It was an honor.
Thank you for the opportunity, and my best to my friends in Poland. And I do say that I have a great respect for what you're doing there, not just with ACT, but also you mentioned the Ukrainian situation, how much Poland has stepped up, and I hope you can work through all the politics you're working through and so forth. I know some difficult things are happening there too, as they are in my country, around the world. But together, maybe the behavioral health and behavioral science folks can find a way to produce a kinder and more supportive and more values-based world.
Great, thank you. So we'll support each other.
Yes.
Thank you.
Support each other in community worldwide. Yeah. And if you're interested in that, you'll find a very receptive community in the ACBS community, and the Polish chapter is very active. So
yeah,
I hope you consider that as well.
Okay, so also for everyone who won't follow the work of the Professor Hayes, so here's some time also for you to say where people can find you, where maybe your books, your newest books, where we can find.
Yeah, the books are easily accessible and even some in Polish through the usual channels. But I do online courses. If you go to Praxis, PRAXISCET, Continuing Education and Training.
I put the link into the description. It will be in the link.
Yeah, the main one, you can just put act.courses and it'll come to me. But if you want to follow me in terms of my newsletter, just go to my name.com. So Steven C. Hayes, all one word, no periods.com, and click on yes, please send it to me. And I'll send you a little 7 email mini course on ACT. Most of you would not need that, but I'll also put you on my newsletter list. And I blog in various places like Today, Medium, and so forth, but all of those start with my newsletter. And I also do a podcast in the newsletter, and it's not yet being put on YouTube. It's only about 10 episodes long, but I just do a little rant about what's going on in my world and what I see going on in the ACT universe and all of that. I don't spam people, and it's a one click, I want out of here if you ever feel as though it's just uninteresting. So yeah, www.stevenchayes.com. And I'd love to have you be part of my journey as well. But I do want to say that you can get a lot just by joining the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. And after you pay, it's called values-based dues. You pay what you can afford, as long as it's over $12, because most of that goes for the free journal, not to us. There's a ridiculous amount of resources for free there on this huge wiki-like site. So you don't have to spend very much to get pretty well trained in ACT. You can access things even without the spendy courses and books and all. Well, the books are not too expensive, but they can be expensive too. So,
I'm also.
You'll be part of that journey.
Thank you. And I am a part of the subscribers of your email list, and it's great because there's a lot of informations like about the processes, about the psychological vaccine. I recommend it. It's great.
Yeah, I try not to just sing my own song. I try to let people know about things that are going on, in the research and in the practice and so forth. So it is an easy way to get a little bit of a strand of what's going on. And I'm glad you. I'm really glad that you like it, Adam.
Thank you.
It's been a lot of work to put together, but I know it's supporting people around the world, so I spend the time.
Okay.
Peace, love, and life.
Thank you. Peace, love, and life.